The first splash of summer came early that year for Thomas Mitchell. Standing in his backyard on a warm Saturday morning in May, he surveyed his kingdom with quiet satisfaction. A modest but well-maintained colonial on a quarter-acre lot in the Whispering Pines subdivision. After 5 years of saving, planning, and navigating the Byzantine world of local permits, today marked the culmination of his dream project, the installation of his very own in-ground swimming pool. "That's the last of the concrete forms," Mr. Mitchell called out Marco, the lead contractor from Blue Waters Pools. "We'll be back on Monday to start the liner installation. Should take about 2 more weeks before you're swimming." Thomas nodded appreciatively, watching the team pack up their equipment. The rectangular hole in his backyard, 15 by 30 feet and surrounded by reinforced concrete walls, hardly resembled the oasis he had envisioned when he'd signed the contract 3 months ago. But Thomas saw beyond the dirt and construction materials. He saw lazy Sunday afternoons floating under the summer sun, neighborhood barbecues with friends gathering around the shimmering water, and quiet evening swims under the stars after long days at the office. "Looking forward to it, Marco. See you Monday." As the contractor's truck pulled away, Thomas felt a familiar prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. He turned slowly toward the fence line that separated his property from 47 Willow Lane, home to Deborah Winters, treasurer of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association and self-appointed guardian of neighborhood decorum. Sure enough, there she stood, a petite woman in her early 60s with immaculately coiffed silver hair. She wore pressed khaki slacks and a powder blue polo shirt emblazoned with the HOA logo, her unofficial uniform. Her arms were crossed tightly across her chest, and even from 30 feet away, Thomas could see the tight-lipped disapproval etched across her face. "Morning, Deborah," Thomas called out with forced cheerfulness. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Deborah didn't return his greeting. Instead, she pointed dramatically at the construction site. "Mr. Mitchell, I don't recall seeing this pool project on the HOA Architectural Review Committee's approval list." Thomas took a deep breath, mentally counting to 5 before responding. This wasn't their first confrontation. In the 3 years since he moved to Whispering Pines, Deborah had cited him for everything from improper trash can placement to unapproved mailbox designs. "That's because I didn't submit it to the architectural committee, Deborah. My property falls outside the HOA covenant boundaries. The original developer annexed this section separately, remember? We've been through this before." Thomas's home and 11 others on Cypress Court existed in a peculiar jurisdictional limbo. When Whispering Pines was initially developed, a surveying error had resulted in these 12 properties being excluded from the HOA's legal boundaries. Despite numerous attempts by the association to rectify this oversight, the homeowners had steadfastly protected their independence, forming what locals jokingly called the Free Republic of Cypress Court. Deborah's thin smile didn't reach her eyes. "I'm well aware of what you believe, Mr. Mitchell. But the board is currently reviewing those old documents. We have reason to believe the exemption was filed improperly. The county records office and my real estate attorney disagree," Thomas replied evenly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got some yard work to finish up." "This isn't over," Deborah called after him as he turned away. "That pool violates at least 6 different HOA guidelines on backyard structures. The board will be discussing this at our meeting on Tuesday." Thomas gave a dismissive wave without looking back, but something in Deborah's tone, a confident smugness he hadn't heard before, gave him pause. He dealt with her empty threats for years, but this felt different somehow. What Thomas couldn't possibly know as he walked back to his garage was that Deborah Winters had already set in motion a campaign that would turn his summer dream into a neighborhood nightmare, one that would eventually involve the local police, the county commissioner's office, and nearly every resident of Whispering Pines. The war over Thomas Mitchell's swimming pool was about to begin. By Wednesday afternoon, Thomas was beginning to understand the gravity of the situation. What had started as yet another petty disagreement with Deborah had rapidly evolved into something far more concerning. The first sign of trouble arrived in Thomas's email inbox at 7:43 a.m., barely 12 hours after the HOA's Tuesday evening meeting. The message, sent from the official Whispering Pines HOA account but unmistakably written in Deborah's clipped, bureaucratic tone, outlined a laundry list of alleged violations related to his pool installation. It cited obscure bylaws regarding non-permissible aquatic structures and unapproved recreational facilities, and demanded that Thomas cease construction immediately or face daily fines of $200. Thomas had promptly forwarded the email to his attorney, Robert Kelsey, with a brief note. "She's at it again. Thoughts?" He'd then headed to work, dismissing the matter as another of Deborah's empty power plays. But now, as he pulled into his driveway after a long day at the engineering firm where he worked as a project manager, Thomas felt a flutter of genuine concern. There, conspicuously posted on a wooden stake at the edge of his front lawn, was an official-looking notice printed on bright orange paper. "Stop work order," it proclaimed in bold black letters, followed by smaller text referencing county ordinance violations. Thomas ripped the notice from the stake and examined it more closely. It appeared authentic, county letterhead, an official seal, even a scrawled signature from someone in the building department. But how? He'd secured all the necessary permits months ago, navigating the county's labyrinthine approval process with meticulous attention to detail. His phone rang. It was Marco from Blue Waters Pools. "Mr. Mitchell, we've got a problem," Marco said without preamble. "I just got a call from the county inspector. Someone filed a complaint about your pool project, claiming we're building too close to the property line and violating some water protection ordinance." Thomas closed his eyes and leaned against his car. "Let me guess, a woman named Deborah Winters?" "Didn't give a name," Marco replied, "but the inspector mentioned something about the HOA bringing it to their attention. We can't continue work until this is resolved. My crew was planning to start the liner installation tomorrow, but now—" He trailed off. "How long will resolving this take?" Thomas asked, already knowing he wouldn't like the answer. "Hard to say. Could be a few days if it's just paperwork. Could be weeks if we need variances or new surveys." After ending the call with a promise to sort things out, Thomas stood in his driveway, the orange notice crumpled in his fist. This wasn't just Deborah being difficult. This was deliberate sabotage. Somehow, she had enough influence at the county level to interfere with a fully permitted construction project. His contemplation was interrupted by the unmistakable sound of a throat being cleared. Thomas turned to find Gary Peterson, his next-door neighbor and reluctant HOA board member, standing awkwardly at the edge of the driveway. "Hey, Tom," Gary said, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Got a minute to talk?" Thomas had always gotten along well with Gary, a retired high school math teacher who tended to his vegetable garden with scientific precision and shared the bounty with neighbors each summer. Unlike most HOA board members, Gary had been drafted into service rather than seeking the position, and he approached his duties with a minimum of zeal. "Let me guess, Deborah sent you as an emissary?" Thomas asked, unable to keep the edge from his voice. Gary winced. "Not exactly. Look, I thought you should know what happened at the meeting yesterday. It wasn't good, Tom. Deborah presented a whole dossier on your pool project, satellite images of your property, copies of the original subdivision plans, even photos she'd taken of the construction from her upstairs window." "Photos? She's been spying on my backyard." Thomas felt his temper rising. "It gets worse," Gary continued, lowering his voice despite the fact that they were alone. "She's convinced half the board that your pool will decrease property values across the entire subdivision. She's calling it an unsightly commercial-scale aquatic facility and claiming it violates some water use restriction from the original development agreement." "That's ridiculous," Thomas snapped. "It's a standard residential pool completely within code." Gary held up his hands. I know. I voted against her motion, but I was outnumbered. The board voted 4-2 to pursue all available remedies to halt construction." He hesitated. "But Tom, the thing you need to know is that Deborah's nephew works in the county permitting office. They're apparently very close." Thomas felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Nepotism. I'd explained how she'd managed to get the county involved so quickly. "Thanks for the heads up, Gary," Thomas said, his mind already racing through possible countermoves. "There's one more thing," Gary added reluctantly. "Deborah mentioned something about the police at the end of the meeting. Said if construction continued, she'd report it as a criminal violation of county ordinances." As Gary walked back to his house, Thomas stood motionless in his driveway, the orange notice still clutched in his hand. What had started as a simple home improvement project was rapidly spiraling into a bureaucratic nightmare with no clear end in sight. His phone buzzed with a text message from his attorney. "Don't worry. She has no legal standing. Call me in the morning." But even as he read the reassuring words, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that Deborah Winters was just getting started. By Saturday morning, 5 days after his confrontation with Deborah, Thomas had transformed his dining room into a makeshift war room. Spread across the oak table was an array of documents. The original subdivision plans from 1998, his property deed highlighting the exemption from HOA covenants, all construction permits for the pool project, and printouts of county zoning ordinances. His laptop was open to a community forum where other Whispering Pines residents had shared their own encounters with Deborah Winters. Thomas hadn't expected to spend his weekend this way. He planned to be watching Marco's crew install the pool liner, perhaps even beginning to visualize the landscaping that would eventually surround his backyard oasis. Instead, he was preparing for battle. "Okay, so we filed a formal objection to the stop work order," said Robert Kelsey, Thomas' attorney, who sat across the table nursing his second cup of coffee. A middle-aged man with thinning hair and the perpetually harried look of someone with too many clients, Robert had nevertheless cleared his Saturday morning schedule when Thomas had called. The good news, Robert continued, is that I've spoken with a contact in the permits department who confirmed your original approvals were all in order. The stop work order was issued under questionable circumstances, to say the least. You mean because Deborah's nephew pushed it through without proper review? Thomas said flatly. Exactly. My contact wouldn't say it explicitly, but reading between the lines, there's definitely some nepotism at play here. Robert shuffled through some papers. We should have the order lifted by Tuesday or Wednesday at the latest. I've also drafted a cease and desist letter to the HOA board regarding their harassment, which I'll send Monday morning. Thomas nodded, feeling a momentary surge of optimism. Perhaps this would end more quickly than he feared. The doorbell rang. Through the frosted glass panel beside his front door, Thomas could make out the distinct shape of a police uniform. His momentary optimism evaporated instantly. You've got to be kidding me, he muttered, opening the door to find a young police officer standing on his porch. The officer's name badge identified him as Patrolman Jenkins. Good morning, sir. Are you Thomas Mitchell? The officer asked, his expression professionally neutral. Yes, that's me. What can I help you with, officer? Thomas replied, conscious of Robert appearing in the hallway behind him. We received a complaint about ongoing construction at this address in violation of a county stop work order, Jenkins explained, glancing past Thomas toward the backyard. I need to verify if construction is continuing and issue a citation if necessary. Thomas felt a surge of anger but kept his voice level. There is no construction happening today, officer. The work was halted as soon as I received the stop work order, which my attorney and I are currently challenging as improperly issued. Jenkins nodded, making a note on his electronic tablet. Mind if I take a quick look at the backyard to confirm? Not at all, Thomas replied, stepping aside. My attorney is here as well if you'd like to speak with him. As they walked through the house toward the back door, Thomas caught a glimpse of movement across the street. Deborah Winters stood on the sidewalk opposite his house, not even attempting to disguise her surveillance. She wore her HOA polo shirt like a uniform, and the smug satisfaction on her face was visible even from a distance. Officer Jenkins was professional and efficient as he surveyed the backyard, noting the half-completed pool and the absence of any workers or ongoing construction. Everything seems to be in compliance with the stop work order, Mr. Mitchell, he confirmed. No citation necessary today. Let me guess, Thomas said as they walked back to the front door. The complaint came from Deborah Winters. Jenkins maintained his neutral expression. I'm not at liberty to say who made the complaint, sir. Of course, Thomas replied with a thin smile. But perhaps you should note that this is part of an ongoing harassment campaign by the local HOA. My property is legally exempt from their jurisdiction, and all the permits for this project were properly obtained. I understand, sir, but I'm just here to check for violations of the stop work order, Jenkins explained, clearly wanting to stay out of the neighborhood dispute. As the officer left, Thomas stood in his doorway, locking eyes with Deborah across the street. Rather than look away at being caught, she raised her cell phone and pointedly took a photo of the police officer leaving Thomas' property, as if documenting her small victory. Well, that was predictable, Robert said, joining Thomas at the door. She's escalating, which actually works in our favor. The more outrageous her behavior, the easier it'll be to demonstrate harassment. Thomas barely heard him. Something had snapped inside at the sight of Deborah photographing his home, at the realization that she had called the police on him for a violation that wasn't occurring. This wasn't just about the pool anymore. It was about his right to live peacefully in his own home without constant surveillance and interference. Change of plans, Thomas said, closing the door and turning to his attorney. I don't just want to get the stop work order lifted. I want to end this permanently. What did you have in mind? Robert asked cautiously. I want to call an emergency meeting of everyone in the Free Republic of Cyprus court. All 12 homeowners who are exempt from the HOA. It's time we presented a united front. Robert nodded slowly. That's actually not a bad idea. Strength in numbers. As Thomas picked up his phone to start making calls, he glanced out the window once more. Deborah was still there, now speaking animatedly with another woman who had joined her on the sidewalk, both occasionally gesturing toward his house. She has no idea what's coming, Thomas murmured, more to himself than to Robert. Until now, he had reacted defensively to each of Deborah's attacks, but that approach was about to change. If Deborah Winters wanted a war over his swimming pool, she was going to. So that's where we stand, Thomas concluded, looking around his living room at the assembled neighbors. Deborah has managed to halt my pool construction through her nephew at the county office. The HOA is threatening daily fines they have no authority to impose, and yesterday she called the police to my house for a violation that wasn't even occurring. It was Sunday evening, less than 36 hours after the police visit. All 12 homeowners from the exempt properties on Cyprus Court had squeezed into Thomas's living room. some seated on the couch and chairs, others standing against the walls. The mood was a mixture of outrage and nervous energy. Elena Rodriguez, a civil engineer who lived 3 doors down, raised her hand. "This isn't just about your pool, Thomas. This is about all of us. If Deborah gets away with this, what's to stop her from coming after my garden greenhouse next? Or Daniel's home workshop?" She gestured toward Daniel Kovacs, a retired carpenter who had converted his garage into a woodworking studio without HOA approval because, like Thomas, he didn't need it. "Exactly," Thomas agreed. "For years, we've all been operating independently, enjoying the freedom that our exempt status provides. But now Deborah seems determined to bring us under HOA control, and she's willing to use some pretty underhanded tactics." "But what can we actually do?" asked Margaret Chen, a recently widowed retiree whose immaculately maintained rose garden was the pride of the neighborhood. "We're just 12 households against the entire HOA board." Robert Kelsey, who had returned for the meeting, cleared his throat. "Actually, there's quite a lot we can do. I've been researching similar cases in the state, and I believe we have multiple avenues for pushback." Over the next hour, the group formulated what they jokingly dubbed Operation Pool Party, a multi-pronged approach to not only get Thomas's pool construction back on track, but also to permanently establish the boundaries between the HOA and the exempt properties. The plan had several components. First, Robert would accelerate the legal challenge to the stop work order, including filing a formal complaint about the apparent conflict of interest involving Deborah's nephew. Second, all 12 households would sign a joint letter to the HOA board clarifying their exempt status and demanding an immediate cessation of all harassment activities. Third, they would attend the next HOA meeting en masse to publicly address the board's overreach. Fourth, and this was Alina's suggestion, they would contact local media about the story. "Nothing scares bureaucrats like public scrutiny," she noted. Finally, they would establish a legal defense fund for any future incidents, with all 12 households contributing. "There's one more thing," said James Washington, a retired high school principal who was the unofficial elder statesman of Cypress Court. "We need to reach out to sympathetic residents within the HOA. Deborah may be loud, but I doubt she speaks for the majority. Many of our friends and neighbors probably have no idea what she's doing in their name." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "Gary Peterson said he voted against the motion to pursue all available remedies against my pool. There must be others who think Deborah is overstepping." As the meeting broke up and neighbors headed home, there was a newfound sense of solidarity and purpose. What had started as Thomas's personal problem had transformed into a community cause. The next morning, Thomas woke early, energized despite getting little sleep. He'd spent much of the night drafting emails and planning the day's activities. By 7:30 a.m., he was showered, dressed, and ready to begin implementing Operation Pool Party. His phone rang. It was Marco. "Mr. Mitchell, you might want to come outside," the contractor said without preamble. "Something's happening at your pool site." Thomas rushed through his house and out the back door, phone still in hand. What he saw stopped him in his tracks. A small bulldozer was parked at the edge of his property, its bright yellow arm extending over his fence. 2 men in county uniforms stood in his backyard, one consulting a clipboard while the other spoke with Marco. Near the half-finished pool, someone had driven stakes into the ground with bright orange tape stretched between them, creating a perimeter around the construction area. "What the hell is going on?" Thomas demanded, approaching the group. The man with the clipboard looked up. "Thomas Mitchell. I'm Roy Davidson from County Code Enforcement. We're here to assess the unauthorized pool structure for potential remediation." "Remediation." Thomas repeated, the word hanging ominously in the morning air. "What exactly does that mean?" "In layman's terms, sir, we're evaluating whether this structure needs to be filled in due to code violations," Davidson replied matter-of-factly. Thomas felt as if the ground had dropped out from under him. "Filled in? This is a properly permitted construction project that's been temporarily halted due to a disputed stop work order. You can't just fill it in." "Actually, sir, under County Ordinance 47B, we can order remediation of any structure that poses a safety hazard or violates water protection guidelines," Davidson countered, tapping his clipboard. "We've received multiple reports that this pool was improperly sited too close to the property line and may be interfering with natural drainage patterns." "Multiple reports?" Thomas's voice rose despite his efforts to remain calm. "Let me guess. All from Deborah Winters?" Davidson's expression remained neutral. "I'm not at liberty to discuss who filed the complaints, sir." As Thomas was about to respond, a movement at the fence line caught his attention. Standing there, phone raised to record the scene, was Deborah. She wasn't even trying to be subtle anymore, her face alight with vindictive triumph. Something changed in Thomas at that moment. The cold rage that had been building gave way to a clarity of purpose he hadn't felt before. Without another word to the county officials, he turned and walked back into his house, pulling up Robert's number on his phone. "Robert," he said when his attorney answered, "they're at my house right now talking about filling in my pool. We need to accelerate everything we discussed last night and add one more item to the list." "What's that?" Robert asked. "I want to file for a restraining order against Deborah Winters today. I got video evidence of her stalking my property, photographing my house, and recording me without consent. This ends now." As Thomas looked out his kitchen window, he could see Deborah still standing at the fence, still recording. She had no idea that in her eagerness to destroy his pool, she had finally gone too far. The real battle was just beginning, and Thomas was no longer fighting alone. The emergency injunction hearing took place 3 days later in the wood-paneled courtroom of Judge Sandra Ortiz. Thomas sat beside Robert at the plaintiff's table, watching as Deborah whispered urgently to her attorney, a nervous-looking man in an ill-fitting suit who kept checking his watch. Behind Thomas, the gallery was filled with supporters. Every resident from the Free Republic of Cyprus court had taken time off work to attend, joined by a surprising number of Whispering Pines residents from within the HOA's jurisdiction. Gary Peterson sat in the front row, having risked Deborah's wrath by openly siding with Thomas. Even more surprising was the presence of 3 of the 7 HOA board members, who had quietly approached Thomas before the hearing to distance themselves from Deborah's actions. "We never authorized any of this," the board's vice president had whispered. "She's been acting unilaterally and using the HOA's name without proper approval." Judge Ortiz, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s with reading glasses perched on the end of her nose, called the court to order precisely at 2:00 p.m. "We're here on the matter of Mitchell versus Winters and the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association," she announced, reviewing the documents before her. "The plaintiff seeks an emergency injunction against further interference with his property and construction project, as well as a temporary restraining order against the defendant, Deborah Winters." For the next hour, Robert methodically presented their case. He introduced the subdivision plans showing Thomas' property's exemption from HOA jurisdiction, the properly obtained permits for the pool construction, and most damaging to Deborah, a compilation of evidence documenting her harassment campaign. The evidence was extensive. Dozens of photographs Deborah had taken of Thomas' property from various angles, timestamped to show the obsessive frequency of her surveillance. Text messages between Deborah and her nephew at the county office, obtained through a records request, revealing her explicit attempts to use family connections to interfere with Thomas' permits. Testimony from neighbors about Deborah's constant presence outside Thomas's home. And finally, the video Thomas had captured of Deborah recording him during the county official's visit, her face clearly showing satisfaction at his distress. "Your Honor," Robert concluded, "what we have here is a clear case of harassment, abuse of power, and potentially illegal interference with properly permitted construction through exploitation of family connections in the county office. My client simply wants to complete his swimming pool, a pool that is fully compliant with all legitimate county regulations and not subject to HOA oversight due to the clear exemption of his property." When Deborah's attorney rose to respond, his defense was surprisingly brief and notably lacking in substance. He attempted to argue that the HOA had a community interest in preventing unsightly structures that might affect property values, but quickly crumbled under Judge Ortiz's pointed questions about the legal basis for HOA authority over exempt properties. And regarding Ms. Winters' personal actions toward Mr. Mitchell, the judge pressed, "How do you explain the pattern of surveillance documented in these exhibits?" Ms. Winters was simply documenting potential violations for HOA records, her attorney offered weakly. From inside her car at 11 p.m. on multiple occasions, Judge Ortiz asked, raising an eyebrow. From the sidewalk across the street for hours at a time, the timestamp data suggests she spent more time watching Mr. Mitchell's house than in her own home. As the hearing progressed, Deborah grew visibly agitated, repeatedly attempting to pass notes to her attorney and once trying to speak directly to the judge, who firmly instructed her to communicate only through counsel. When the arguments concluded, Judge Ortiz took only 15 minutes to reach her decision. This court grants the emergency injunction preventing any further interference with Mr. Mitchell's pool construction, she announced. The county's stop work order is hereby suspended pending a full review by the permits department, which this court instructs to be conducted by officials with no family or personal connection to either party. Thomas felt a surge of relief, but the judge wasn't finished. Additionally, the court grants a temporary restraining order requiring Ms. Winters to maintain a distance of at least 100 feet from Mr. Mitchell and his property at all times, with no direct or indirect communication. Ms. Winters is specifically prohibited from photographing or recording Mr. Mitchell or his property, and from making complaints to county officials about Mr. Mitchell's property without first having those complaints reviewed by HOA legal counsel. She peered sternly at Deborah over her reading glasses. The court is deeply troubled by the evidence of what appears to be a personal vendetta being pursued under the guise of HOA enforcement. Should these actions continue, Ms. Winters may face more serious legal consequences. As the court adjourned, Thomas was surrounded by neighbors offering congratulations. Through the crowd, he caught sight of Deborah storming out of the courtroom, her face mottled with rage. Her attorney trailed behind, looking defeated. Outside on the courthouse steps, a local news van was parked at the curb, a reporter preparing to go live. Elena Rodriguez caught Thomas' eye and gave him a thumbs up. Her media contacts had come through. "Mr. Mitchell," the reporter called, microphone extended, "can you tell us about your dispute with the Whispering Pines HOA and how it escalated to the point of requiring court intervention?" Thomas paused, considering his response carefully. He could use this opportunity to publicly humiliate Deborah, to detail every petty and vindictive action she had taken against him. The temptation was strong. Instead, he smiled diplomatically. This was unfortunately a case of overreach by one individual who mistakenly believed her authority extended to properties that are legally exempt from HOA governance. Today's ruling simply reaffirms the boundaries that have always existed and ensures that homeowners like myself can enjoy our properties within the bounds of county regulations without undue harassment. "And what about your pool?" the reporter asked. "Construction resumes tomorrow," Thomas replied with a genuine smile. "And when it's finished, I'm planning a neighborhood pool party. Everyone's invited, though some restrictions apply." The gathered neighbors laughed, understanding the unspoken exception. As Thomas walked to his car with Robert, his phone buzzed with a text from Marco. "Just heard the news. Crew will be there 8 a.m. sharp tomorrow. Congrats, Mr. Mitchell." For the first time in weeks, Thomas felt the weight lifting from his shoulders. His backyard oasis was back on track. The Free Republic of Cyprus Court had successfully defended its sovereignty. And most importantly, Deborah Winters had finally been forced to stay out of his business. What Thomas didn't know yet was that the story was far from over. The fallout from today's hearing would reverberate through Whispering Pines in ways no one could have anticipated, least of all Deborah herself. 6 weeks later, on a perfect July afternoon, Thomas stood at the edge of his completed swimming pool, admiring the way sunlight danced across the crystal-clear water. The transformation of his backyard was remarkable. What had once been a construction site surrounded by mud and equipment was now a pristine oasis with elegant limestone coping, a small waterfall feature, and freshly laid flagstone decking. Newly planted palm trees and ornamental grasses softened the edges, creating a resort-like atmosphere that exceeded even Thomas's original vision. "You've got to admit it was worth all the drama," remarked Elena Rodriguez, raising her glass of lemonade and a toast. She was seated at one of several patio tables Thomas had set up around the pool, where nearly 30 neighbors had gathered for the inaugural Free Republic pool party. The atmosphere was festive, with children splashing in the shallow end, the aroma of grilled burgers and hot dogs filling the air, and conversations flowing as freely as the drinks. Looking around at the assembled guests, a mix of Cyprus Court residents and sympathetic HOA members, Thomas felt a profound sense of community that hadn't existed before Deborah's crusade against his pool. "It was worth it for more than just the pool," Thomas replied, taking his seat beside Elena. "Look around, half these people barely knew each other 2 months ago." It was true. The battle against Deborah had forged unexpected alliances throughout the neighborhood. Residents who had previously exchanged nothing more than polite waves when collecting their mail were now planning joint garage sales, community garden initiatives, and even a fall festival. Gary Peterson approached with a plate of food and joined them. "Have you heard the latest?" he asked, his voice low despite the ambient noise of the party. "About Deborah?" Thomas asked. "I try not to keep tabs on her these days." The restraining order meant that Deborah had been conspicuously absent from his life since the court hearing, a welcome change after weeks of constant surveillance. "The special HOA board meeting is scheduled for next Wednesday," Gary said. "Word is they're voting on whether to remove her as treasurer and possibly from the board entirely." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Really? I didn't think they had the stomach for that kind of confrontation." "Things changed after the county investigation," Elena pointed out. "Once they started looking into her nephew's activities at the permits office, a lot of other questionable decisions came to light. The county's internal investigation, prompted by Judge Ortiz's order, had revealed that Deborah's nephew had intervened in at least 17 permit applications over the past 3 years, either fast-tracking approvals for friends of Deborah or creating obstacles for homeowners who had crossed her. 3 county employees had been placed on administrative leave pending further investigation, and the local newspaper had run a front-page expose titled HOA Corruption, When Community Power Goes Unchecked. "I heard her nephew might face criminal charges," Gary added, lowering his voice further. "Abuse of public office or something similar." Thomas shook his head. "I never wanted to go that far. I just wanted to build my pool." "That's the difference between you and Deborah," Elena said. "You want to be left alone. She wanted control." Their conversation was interrupted by James Washington. who clinked a spoon against his glass to get everyone's attention. "If I could have a moment," the retired principal called out, his resonant voice carrying across the backyard. The chatter gradually subsided as guests turned to listen. "I'd like to propose a toast to our host, Thomas Mitchell, who not only built this beautiful pool, but also reminded us all of the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it would be easier to back down." Chorus of hear rose from the gathering, glasses raised toward Thomas, who felt a flush of embarrassment at being the center of attention. And James continued with a mischievous smile, "I'd like to announce that the Free Republic of Cyprus Court has unanimously voted to establish an annual tradition. Every summer on the anniversary of Judge Ortiz's ruling, we will host a neighborhood pool crawl, visiting each new pool, hot tub, or water feature that residents have installed without HOA approval." Laughter and applause greeted this announcement, along with immediate speculation about who might be next to break ground on a backyard project. As the party continued into the evening, Thomas found himself by the pool's edge, watching as the underwater lights automatically illuminated with the setting sun, casting a blue glow across the water. Gary joined him, both men silently appreciating the peaceful scene. "You know what the irony is?" Gary finally said. "If Deborah had just left you alone, this would have been a quiet, private pool that only a few people would ever see or use. Instead, she turned it into a symbol and practically guaranteed that more exempt homeowners will follow your lead." Thomas nodded. "That's often how these things go. The harder someone pushes for control, the more resistance they create." "Speaking of which," Gary added hesitantly, "there's something else you should know. I wasn't going to mention it today, but Deborah's house went on the market yesterday." Thomas turned to him in surprise. "She's moving?" Apparently, the combination of the restraining order, the pending removal from the board, and the social fallout has been too much. "I heard she's looking at one of those 55-plus communities down in Florida. Ironically, one with even stricter HOA rules than Whispering Pines."